in his first 7 months in office, Zuma has appointed a Reserve Bank Governor, National Police Commissioner, Head of Intelligence, Chief Justice and other Constitutional Court judges, and then the National Director of Public Prosecutions. What can one read into these appointments?
Well, clearly the first point to make is that most of the appointments, both at cabinet level and outside of cabinet, to other state institutions, other government institutions, have been quite inclusive. And they're inclusive in the sense that they include different trajectories and strands of thinking within the African National Congress mainstream, but they also are quite deliberately inclusive of alliance partners, for instance from COSATU and the South African Communist Party. So clearly the alliance has been catered for in a general sense. But at a deeper level, even some of the ideological fractures and political fractures and fights we might have anticipated between what we thought about emerging out of the Zuma and Mbeki conflict and the split of Cope, is that there's been some containment strategy, and people who have been appointed to certain positions, it was never anticipated that they would. So clearly that there is a strategy of driving towards inclusion, but also driving towards containment to minimize the fact that you might have further defections from the ANC. So I think many of the appointments have been quite smart. They balance the different perspectives in the ANC, they bring in the alliance partners, they engage in a policy of containment to minimize the fact that other people might leave the ANC to go and find a home in another party, for instance in COPE, and that fear still remains very real, even though COPE has not performed very well and has its own organizational challenges. But some of the other appointments, I think, outside of the broad strategic thrust which seems to have informed some of these appointments, have raised lots of vigorous debate, and in some cases justifiably so. So, for instance, I think the first appointment that I would want to elaborate on is the appointment of Jimmy Manyi to the Department of Labour, when, you know, this is a person who keeps saying that there's absolutely no skills crisis. It's something that we're thinking up, and in part he may be speaking the truth. However, I think his understanding of the way in which the dynamics have worked have been fairly unnuanced. Having come from a management side and having come from a business side, it's difficult to understand how sympathetic it would be to labour concerns and running a labour department which will more fine-tune itself to a greater amount of regulatory effectiveness in the labour department. Because, I mean, I think our labour market remains a little bit flexible, and I think many of the noises we've been hearing about inflexible labour markets actually made too much of. So I think that's the one appointment which actually does concern people. But the one which concerns people a great deal more is in the security sector, or the security cluster, if you will, and the appointment of the Director of Public Prosecutions most recently has brought about the greatest amount of furore. And this, of course, is premised on the fact that this individual that's been appointed has given evidence before a Jinwala Commission in the case of the former Director of Public Prosecutions, and was found to be a less than reliable witness, and a lot of what he had to say was not actually taken very cogently by that Jinwala Commission, and yet this person was a key instrument, it appears, in what it was anticipated Mbeki's plans at the time was. But this very individual then repudiated that in the first instance, but still the fact remains that he was not a credible witness before a commission. And yet found a way to appoint him as the Director of Public Prosecutions. Of course, there's some evidence to suggest that while he was Director General of the Department of Justice, that he indicated a lot of excessive deference towards executive mindedness. And in a national prosecuting authority which needs to vehemently guard its independence, such executive-minded behavior or inclinations towards the executive or any other state institution or sector of society is in fact not very welcome. Not in the kind of constitutional dispensation in which we have effective separation of powers and functions, which we seek as a society. So I think that also raises concerns. Then in the Ministry of Police, as we may now call it, has raised sort of many debates about the approach of the shoot-to-kill policy. And much of this shoot-to-kill policy is in fact, in my view, a red herring. And it's simply a red herring because you can only shoot to kill if you're actually on the spot. And I think we're all aware that our police are often not on the spot. So quite who they're going to be shooting to kill is another matter entirely. The second problem is that, the reality is that we simply have a police force which don't do their job. So whether you have a policy of shoot to kill or being tough is really immaterial. What you really need to change is the institutional culture in the police service. Now, if the rhetoric is simply serving to motivate police officers, then perhaps maybe fine. But it doesn't seem that that comes along with a corresponding desire to want to shift and change some of the institutional cultures within the police force. So, of course, that's another appointment which has raised concern. I think that the Reserve Bank governor, the appointment it's not so much the individual's appointment that's been questioned, but it's more the role of the Reserve Bank. Of course, the Youth League would question that, another white woman in the role of the Reserve Bank, while she remains a member and is a cadre of the ANC, was not, in their view, the most appropriate appointment. It is a view, but it's a view which can be incredibly reductionist and reduce everything to racial tokenism. And the fact that we're beginning to see a discourse emerging that premises of a transformation agenda or the transformation of the society on the simple binary of racial indicators. And that might not in it of itself necessarily always be a good thing. I think everyone recognizes the fact that racial transformation and the transformation in race relations is fundamental to changing our society. But it does not always lead to the kind of desirable development outcomes that we require. And in some cases, I think this racialized discourse does impedes rather than advances some of the development outcomes we may wish to see. And the same thing applied in the case of Bobby Gotzel and Jacob Marocha at Eskom. So I think this is a discourse which undermines some of the very important appointments we might be able to make. But again, on balance, some very good appointments and some appointments which raise serious questions. But I think they have to be viewed within the context of a strategy of containment, inclusion, and consultation across the board.
What could President Zuma's reasoning have been in some of these controversial appointments?
Well, I think in part it's to appoint people who understand not just the functioning of the state institutions, but understand how society is driven by individual behavior and what different social cultures might exist. And so the logic behind appointing, for instance, someone to the Reserve Bank is that this person understands the institutional role and culture of the Reserve Bank, what its function should be, and to try, if there's going to be a reorientation of the role, to try and mix it and match it with what it ought to ideally do in terms of reaching certain policy targets. That could be the logic in that case. In the case of appointing the Commissioner of Police or Police Commissioner, I think the logic was that this is someone who understands or may understand both the cultures that drive behavior in the police force on the one hand, but also what social cultures drive individual behavior and motivators of crime in certain of the areas in which crime is endemic. And so that may have been the rationale, but one can't be sure. In the case of Menzies Simelane, I think it's quite clear that this was an appointment which was going to be someone who will be able to be malleable, who may not be as independent-minded as someone else might be. But that may not necessarily be the case. We simply don't know, which is why I think transparency and the logic of explanation for why certain appointments are made are necessary in a democracy, so that there is sufficient public confidence that the role and functions in those institutions will be carried out appropriately, rather than to the advantage of any one or other social or political actor.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa, reviewing the year's political landscape.